The warehouse was already collapsing when he ran inside. Flames had swallowed the first floor. Steel beams were screaming as they twisted in the heat. Every instinct told him to turn back. But through the smoke, he saw her trapped beneath fallen debris, choking on smoke, barely conscious, seconds from death. He didn't hesitate. He pulled her out, shielded her with his body as the building came down behind them. Disappeared before anyone could see his face, his hands still black with ash. He thought he'd saved a stranger. 3 hours later, staring at a hospital news report, her face filling the screen, her name in red letters across the bottom, he learned the truth. The woman in his arms, the one he'd risked everything for, was Elena DeLuca, daughter of the man who'd murdered his brother, heir to the family he'd sworn to destroy. And that one moment of humanity just ignited a war that would force him to choose between loyalty and the one person who could dismantle everything he'd ever believed in. But before you judge his choice, you need to understand what that rescue actually set in motion. Because this wasn't just about one man saving one woman. This was about what happens when a single act of conscience becomes an act of war. Roman Vale didn't just pull Elena DeLuca from that fire. He disrupted a carefully orchestrated plan that had been in motion for months. Someone wanted that building to explode. Someone wanted Elena inside when it happened. And someone was counting on her not walking out. The moment Roman interfered, he became a problem for both sides. His own family, the Carrington Syndicate, started asking questions he couldn't answer. Why was he there? How did he reach her so fast? And most dangerous of all, why didn't he let her die? Across the river, the DeLuca family was asking different questions. Who saved their daughter? Why did he disappear? And what does he want in return? But here's the part that changes everything. The explosion wasn't about territory. It wasn't retaliation for some old grudge. It was engineered from the inside, by someone who needed both families at war. By someone who stood to gain everything if Elena died, and the DeLucas blamed the Carringtons. Roman just saved the wrong person, and now he's the only one who knows the truth. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand the choice Roman made that night, you have to understand the world he was born into. Not the world he chose, the world that chose him. This story starts 15 years earlier, when Roman Vale was just 17 years old, standing on a rain-soaked sidewalk at 11:47 p.m., watching paramedics cover his brother's body with a yellow tarp. Nathan Vale wasn't involved in organized crime. He worked night shifts at a shipping dock, saved every dollar for community college, and walked the same route home every single night. But on October 9th, two rival crews opened fire 3 blocks away, and a stray bullet found Nathan's chest. He died before the ambulance arrived. Roman stood there, frozen in the rain, watching the only family he had left bleed out on concrete. Their parents were already gone. Nathan was supposed to protect him. And in one moment of random violence, Roman's entire world collapsed. That's when Victor Carrington found him. Not out of charity, not out of guilt. Victor understood something most people never learn. Trauma either destroys you or it turns you into something harder. Roman could have spiraled into revenge, into recklessness, into self-destruction. Instead, he turned cold, calculated, focused. At 18, Roman joined the Carrington Syndicate. Not for money, not for power, but for structure. For protection, for a family that wouldn't leave him standing alone in the rain again. And Victor trained him personally. Victor Carrington ran an empire most people didn't even know existed. On paper, he was a real estate developer, a logistics executive, a man who owned shipping companies, construction firms, and import businesses that operated across 3 states. His signature appeared on legitimate contracts. He attended charity galas. He donated to political campaigns. But beneath the surface was something else entirely. A shadow network that controlled territory, contracts, and people through calculated pressure and strategic violence. Victor didn't believe in spectacle. He believed in precision. Where other crime families made headlines, Victor made moves no one saw coming until it was too late. He studied his competitors, identified their weaknesses, waited for the perfect moment. And when he moved, it was absolute. Contracts dissolved overnight, supply chains vanished, leverage evaporated. By the time his rivals understood what was happening, they'd already lost. And the man Victor trusted most to handle problems without creating chaos was Roman Vale. Because Roman learned something in those years that most enforcers never grasp. Violence is easy. Control is hard. By the time Roman turned 35, he'd become something rare in that world, a man who didn't drink recklessly, didn't speak carelessly, didn't act without thinking 3 moves ahead. He was Victor's quiet storm, the enforcer who resolved conflicts without headlines, loyal, disciplined, unshakable. Across the river, on the east side of the city, stood a different kind of empire, the DeLuca family. Where Victor Carrington preferred strategy and silence, Salvatore DeLuca believed in dominance through fear. Public displays of power, intimidation that sent messages no one could misinterpret. If you crossed the DeLucas, everyone knew about it. If you owed them money, the consequences were visible. Salvatore's philosophy was simple. Fear is currency. The more people feared you, the less you actually had to enforce. His reputation did the work for him. The rivalry between Carrington and DeLuca wasn't about business. It was generational. Their fathers had fought over territory before them. Their grandfathers had drawn the original lines in blood. Decades of accumulated grudges, retaliations, and betrayals had created a cold war that defined the city's underworld. They didn't negotiate. They didn't compromise. They existed in a state of perpetual tension, waiting for the other side to make a mistake. And somewhere in the middle of that hatred, caught between 2 empires built on violence, was Salvatore's daughter, Elena DeLuca. Elena wasn't naive. She grew up understanding exactly what her last name meant. She knew where the money came from. She knew what happened to people who disrespected her father. She'd seen men come to their house in the middle of the night, bleeding and desperate, begging for mercy. She'd watched her father make decisions that ended lives with a single phone call. But Elena made a choice. She refused to become part of the machine. While her father's associates negotiated territorial agreements and shipping contracts in private clubs, Elena studied urban planning and nonprofit management. She wanted to build affordable housing, community health clinics, education programs, things that actually helped the neighborhoods her father's empire had spent decades exploiting. Salvatore funded her work, partly because he loved his daughter and wanted to give her what she asked for, partly because it was excellent for his public image. A ruthless crime boss with a humanitarian daughter made for good optics. But Elena genuinely believed she could take the blood money and turn it into something clean. She believed she could build something meaningful from something corrupt. She was wrong about one thing. You can't plant anything good in soil soaked with violence and expect it to grow without consequences. The night of the explosion, March 14th, Elena wasn't anywhere near her father's business. She was inspecting a redevelopment property her foundation had just purchased. An old warehouse district her nonprofit planned to convert into affordable housing. She walked through the empty building with an architect and a city planning consultant, discussing floor plans and structural integrity. She had no idea that building sat directly between Carrington and DeLuca shipping routes. She had no idea negotiations over territorial access had collapsed earlier that afternoon. She had no idea someone had planted explosives in the basement as a message. Roman wasn't supposed to be there either. Victor had sent him to observe a disputed property, not to intervene, just to document who showed up. Standard surveillance. Roman was parked 2 blocks away, watching through binoculars when the first explosion tore through the building's foundation. The blast hit at 9:43 p.m. Roman felt it before he heard it. A pressure wave that rattled his car windows. Then the sound. A deep, tearing boom that echoed across the waterfront. He looked up just in time to see the warehouse's east wall buckle outward, Flames erupted from the ground floor, angry and orange, consuming everything in their path. Within seconds, black smoke was pouring through shattered windows. Steel beams groaned under the stress. The building was coming apart. Roman's training told him to stay in the car. Document what happened. Call it in. Wait for instructions. But then he saw movement through the smoke. Third floor. East corner. Someone was still inside. He was out of the car before he made the conscious decision to move. The front entrance was already engulfed. He circled to the loading dock, found a service door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the heat hit him like a physical force. The air was thick with smoke and chemicals. He pulled his jacket over his mouth and pushed forward. The first floor was an inferno. Flames crawled up walls, ceiling tiles melted and dripped. The floor beneath his feet was hot enough to feel through his boots. He found the stairwell. The metal railing was already too hot to touch. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his lungs burning with every breath. On the third floor, the smoke was so thick he couldn't see 5 feet ahead. He moved by instinct, following the sound of coughing, desperate, wet, weakening. He found her in what used to be an office. A steel beam had collapsed across her legs. She was on her back, barely conscious, blood running from a gash on her forehead. Her eyes were unfocused. She was trying to push the beam off, but she didn't have the strength. Roman didn't ask questions, didn't check if she was alone, didn't think about whose territory this was or who she might be. He just moved. He wedged his shoulder under the beam, felt the heat through his jacket, and lifted. The metal groaned. His legs screamed, but it moved. Just enough. He pulled her free, scooped her into his arms, and turned back toward the stairwell. Behind them, another explosion rocked the building. The 4th floor collapsed. Debris rained down. A piece of concrete the size of a microwave crashed inches from his head. He ran. Down the stairs. Through the smoke. Through the flames. The building was collapsing in real time. Walls buckled. Windows exploded outward. He could feel the structure giving way beneath his feet. He made it to the loading dock just as the roof caved in, shielded her body with his own as chunks of steel and concrete crashed where they'd been standing seconds before. Outside, the air was cold and clean and shocking. He laid her on the pavement, checked her pulse. Weak but steady. She was breathing, coughing, alive. In the distance, sirens were getting closer. He could hear shouting. Security. First responders. People running toward the building. He looked down at his hands. Black with ash and soot. His jacket was singed. His lungs felt raw. And the woman at his feet was a stranger. He didn't know her name. Didn't know why she'd been in that building. Didn't know if she'd been alone or with others. He just knew she was alive. And that was enough. Roman disappeared into the shadows before anyone could see his face. Melted into the crowd gathering on the street. Walked back to his car with his head down and his hands in his pockets. He drove for 20 minutes before his hands stopped shaking. When he got back to his apartment, he stripped off his clothes, took a scalding shower, and stood under the water until it ran clear. He thought that was the end of it. A random act, a moment of instinct, something he'd never think about again. Then he turned on the television. The news was already covering the explosion. Aerial footage showed the warehouse reduced to a smoking skeleton. Firefighters were still battling flames on the lower floors. The Chiron scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Breaking. Explosion rocks waterfront district. 1 survivor pulled from wreckage. Roman was reaching for the remote to turn it off when her face appeared. Professional photo. Dark hair. Sharp eyes. The kind of photo that gets used in press releases and foundation websites, and beneath her face, in red letters that burned themselves into his memory. Elena DeLuca, daughter of Salvatore DeLuca, survives explosion. Condition stable. Roman's jaw tightened. The remote slipped from his hand. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. He stood there, frozen, staring at the screen as the reality crashed over him. The woman he'd carried through fire. The stranger whose life he'd risked everything to save. Was the daughter of Salvatore DeLuca. The man whose organization had killed his brother 15 years ago. The man Victor Carrington had spent decades trying to dismantle, and Roman had just given him back his only heir. The morning after the explosion, the city felt wrong. Too quiet, like the calm before something worse. Roman stood in Victor Carrington's office on the 40th floor of a glass tower downtown, watching his boss study security footage on a wide monitor. The video played in slow motion, of flames, smoke, men scattering, and then Roman, carrying her. Victor didn't speak for a long time. The silence was heavier than any accusation. Finally, without looking away from the screen, Victor said, "Do you know who that is?" Roman's voice stayed level. "I do now." Victor turned slowly. His expression was unreadable, calm in a way that was more dangerous than anger. "Elena DeLuca," he said, "Salvatore's only child. The person we've spent 15 years making sure never gains power in that family." He paused. Let the weight of it settle. "Why did you bring her out?" There it was, the question beneath the question. Not why did you save a life? Why did you save his life? Roman met his gaze. "She would have died." And? That single word carried 3 decades of bloodshed. All the territory wars. All the betrayals. All the bodies buried in the foundation of both empires. Victor wasn't asking why Roman acted on instinct. He was asking why Roman chose humanity over loyalty. "You're telling me," Victor continued, his voice quiet and measured, "that you ran into a collapsing building, risked your life, and pulled out the one person on this earth whose survival directly threatens everything we've built. And your only explanation is that she would have died?" Roman didn't flinch. "Yes." Victor studied him for a long moment. Then he closed the laptop. "We have a problem," he said, "because now Salvatore knows someone from our side was at that building, and he's going to want to know why." Roman understood immediately. If the DeLucas discovered a Carrington enforcer had been near the explosion, they'd assume it was surveillance. Or worse, sabotage. The rescue wouldn't matter. The optics were already poisonous. Victor leaned against his desk. "Salvatore is going to think we tried to kill his daughter and failed, and when he moves, it won't be subtle." Roman's mind was already working through the implications. "So we confirm it was an accident. Make it clear we had nothing to do with the explosion." "And how do we explain your presence?" Roman didn't have an answer, because there was no good explanation. Not one that wouldn't sound like a lie. Across the river, in a private hospital suite, Elena DeLuca was having a different conversation. Her father sat beside her bed, his face carved from stone. 2 of his most trusted men stood by the door. Elena's head was wrapped in bandages, her ribs were bruised, but her mind was clear. "Who saved me?" she asked quietly. The room fell silent. Her father's jaw tightened. One of his men, a lawyer named Vincent, spoke carefully. "One of our security team reached you before the building collapsed." Elena turned her head slowly, wincing at the pain. "No," she said. "He wasn't ours." Her father leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I saw his eyes," Elena said, "through the smoke. He was calm, focused, not panicking, not emotional. That's not how someone reacts unless they're trained." She paused, remembering the way he'd moved, the way he'd shielded her, the way he'd disappeared without waiting for gratitude. "He wasn't loyal to you," she continued. "He was someone else." Salvatore's expression darkened. "You're saying someone from Carrington's organization saved you?" "I don't know," Elena admitted. "But whoever he wasn't there by accident." Back in Carrington territory, whispers were already spreading. Why was Roman at the explosion site before it happened? How did he reach Elena so quickly? Why didn't he call for backup? Why did he disappear? In their world, doubt spreads faster than fire, and once it starts, it's impossible to contain. By nightfall, Roman understood something that made his blood run cold. The explosion wasn't random, it was too precise, too targeted. The building was empty except for Elena. The timing was perfect. The explosives were military grade. This wasn't retaliation. It wasn't a warning. It was an assassination attempt. Someone wanted Elena DeLuca dead. And when Roman started tracing the money, the shell companies, the encrypted communications that led to the purchase of those explosives, the trail didn't point to some outside enemy. It pointed inward. To someone inside the Carrington syndicate. To someone close enough to Victor to know his schedule, his strategies, his blind spots. Someone who'd been planning this for months. And Roman had just ruined everything by saving her. The war wasn't between families anymore. It was internal, and Roman was standing in the middle of it. If this story has your heart racing, comment, "I'm still watching." Let's see who's truly following this to the end. Elena couldn't stop thinking about him. Not romantically. Not in some fantasy where the stranger who saved her would become something more, but because nothing about that rescue made sense. She replayed the moment over and over. The way he'd moved through the smoke without hesitation. The way he'd lifted that beam off her legs like he'd done it 100 times before. The way he'd shielded her body with his own when the building came down. That wasn't panic. That wasn't luck. That was training. 3 days after the explosion, against her father's explicit orders, Elena started asking questions. Quietly. Carefully. She reached out to a private investigator she'd worked with on her nonprofit projects. Someone outside her father's network. Someone who wouldn't report back. She gave him what little she remembered. The approximate time. The location. The fact that her savior had disappeared before anyone official arrived. Within 48 hours, the investigator came back with security footage from a traffic camera 2 blocks away. Grainy. Dark. But visible. A man walking away from the explosion site, hands in his pockets, head down, jacket singed. And when the investigator ran facial recognition through law enforcement databases and cross-referenced with known associates of organized crime families in the city, one name surfaced. Roman Vale, Carrington's enforcer, her father's enemy. Elena stared at the photo for a long time. She should have felt anger, betrayal. The man who saved her life worked for the organization that had been trying to destroy her family for decades, but instead she felt something far more dangerous. Curiosity. Because if Roman Vale worked for Victor Carrington, why would he risk everything to save Salvatore DeLuca's daughter? What did he gain? What did he want? Unless he didn't want anything. Unless it was just instinct. And that possibility, that a man raised in violence could still choose humanity in a split second, was more threatening to everything Elena had been taught than any act of war. Meanwhile, Roman was conducting his own investigation, not because Victor ordered it, but because something about the explosion didn't sit right. He started with the basics: the building's ownership records, recent transactions, who had access. The explosives used were military grade, C4, professionally placed in load-bearing sections of the foundation. This wasn't some amateur job. This was precise, calculated, designed to bring the entire structure down in seconds, and the more Roman dug, the more resistance he encountered. Not from the DeLucas, from his own side. Meetings he wasn't invited to anymore. Conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. Victor watching him with an expression that wasn't quite suspicion, but wasn't quite trust either. The phone records that had been wiped. Financial transfers that disappeared from internal servers hours after Roman started looking for them. Someone inside the Carrington syndicate was covering tracks, and whoever it was had enough access to erase evidence in real time. Then, 6 weeks after the explosion, Elena did something reckless. She requested a meeting, not through official channels, not through her father's people, through a neutral charity event both families funded quietly for public relations. A gala for children's hospitals. The kind of event where enemies could stand in the same room without anyone asking questions. Roman saw her the moment she entered the ballroom. She wore a deep navy dress that somehow made her look both elegant and untouchable. Her hair was pulled back. The cut on her forehead had healed into a thin scar. She moved through the crowd with purpose, shaking hands, smiling at donors, playing the role of humanitarian heiress perfectly. And then her eyes found his. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. The room seemed to shrink. The noise faded. Then she walked toward him. They stood face to face for the first time without smoke between them. "You saved my life," Elena said quietly. Her voice was steady. No gratitude, no emotion, just fact. "You shouldn't be here," Roman replied. "Neither should you." There was no romance in that moment, no softening, only tension, history, danger. But in her eyes, Roman saw something that mirrored his own conflict. She didn't choose this war any more than he did, and neither of them knew how to escape it. "I know who you are," Elena continued. "Roman Vale, Victor Carrington's enforcer, the man my father has wanted dead for 5 years." Roman's expression didn't change. "And yet, you're standing here, talking to me." "Because I want to know why," Elena said. "Why would you risk everything to save me?" Roman didn't answer immediately, because the truth was complicated. The truth was that in that moment she wasn't a DeLuca. She was just a person about to die, and he couldn't live with himself if he'd walked away. "Does it matter?" he finally said. Elena studied him. "Yes, because someone wanted me in that building, and I don't think it was your people." That was the beginning. Every meeting after that became a calculated risk. A coffee shop with 2 exits and clear sight lines. A parking garage at 2 in the morning with both of them checking mirrors for tails. Conversations that lasted 10 minutes if it felt like hours. She challenged him in ways no one else did. "Do you ever question it?" Elena asked once, stirring cold coffee she wasn't drinking. "Question what?" "The loyalty, the violence, the idea that we inherit hatred like property. That because our fathers wanted each other dead, we're supposed to want the same thing." Roman didn't answer immediately, because the truth was, he had begun questioning it. The night he carried her out of that fire, something shifted. He'd spent 15 years believing the DeLucas were the enemy, that Salvatore DeLuca had ordered the hit that killed his brother, that revenge and loyalty were the same thing. But sitting across from Elena, watching her struggle with the same doubts, he realized something. They were both prisoners, just in different cells, and somewhere in the shadows someone was watching, taking photos, logging meeting times, building a case, because in their world, doubt was a weapon, and Roman and Elena had just handed someone all the ammunition they needed. The truth came in the form of numbers, bank transfers, shell companies with names that meant nothing. Payments made 3 weeks before the explosion. Roman found them by accident. He'd been tracing the purchase records for the C4 used in the blast, following a trail of falsified invoices and encrypted communications. The explosives had been purchased through a front company registered in Delaware, untraceable on the surface, but Roman had access to Carrington's internal financial systems. And when he cross-referenced the dates and amounts, he found a matching transfer from a Carrington account. The payment had been authorized by someone with executive-level access, someone who'd been with Victor for decades, someone trusted enough to move money without questions. Marcus Hale, Victor's right hand for 20 years, the man who sat in every strategy meeting, who knew every operation, every weakness, every blind spot. Roman stared at the screen for a long time, his mind working through the implications. Hale had orchestrated the explosion, not to kill Elena specifically, but to provoke Salvatore into retaliation, to engineer a war that would force Victor to escalate. and in the chaos, Hale could consolidate power beneath Victor's aging leadership. Elena was never the target. She was the spark, the catalyst designed to ignite something neither family could control, and Roman had ruined the plan by saving her. When Roman finally confronted Hale, it wasn't in Victor's office. It was in a parking structure at midnight. Just the two of them. No witnesses. Hale leaned against his car, arms crossed, completely calm. Like he'd been expecting this. "You've been asking questions," Hale said. It wasn't a question. "You planted the explosives," Roman replied. "You wanted her dead." Hale smiled. Not warmth. Just acknowledgement. "I wanted chaos. There's a difference. You tried to murder an innocent woman to start a war." "She's not innocent," Hale said. "She's a DeLuca. And you saved the wrong person, Roman. You always were too soft for this world." Roman's jaw tightened. "Victor trusted you." "Victor is getting old," Hale said simply. "His strategies are outdated. His patience is costing us territory. We needed escalation. We needed the DeLucas to move first so we could justify a response that would end them permanently." He straightened. "But you interfered. And now you're asking questions that are going to get you killed." Roman understood then. The war between Carrington and DeLuca wasn't inevitable. It wasn't some generational curse that couldn't be broken. It was engineered, maintained, perpetuated by people like Hale who profited from conflict. And if Roman exposed him publicly, he risked tearing the syndicate apart from within. But if he stayed silent, Elena remained a target, and the next attempt wouldn't fail. "You won't get away with this," Roman said quietly. Hale laughed. "I already have. Because even if you tell Victor, even if you show him the transfers, he'll have to choose between believing me, a man who stood beside him for 20 years, or believing you, the enforcer who saved his enemy's daughter and has been meeting with her in secret for weeks." Roman's blood went cold. Hale knew about the meetings, which meant someone had been watching, documenting, building a case that made Roman look like the traitor. "You're going to walk away," Hale continued, "or I'm going to make sure everyone believes you've been working with the DeLucas this entire time. Your choice." But Roman had already made his choice. Not for Elena, not for love, but for truth. Because loyalty without morality was just obedience. And Roman was done being controlled by men who engineered wars for profit. Roman didn't confront Hale again. He gathered evidence instead. Every bank transfer, every shell company registration, every encrypted communication that connected Hale to the explosives supplier, security footage that showed Hale meeting with contractors who had no legitimate business with Carrington operations, financial records proving Hale had been siphoning money for years, building a war chest for the chaos he planned to create. It took Roman 3 days to compile everything into a single file. Organized, irrefutable, damning. Then he walked into Victor Carrington's office and placed it on the desk. Victor looked up, surprised. "What is this?" "Proof," Roman said, "that Marcus Hale orchestrated the explosion that nearly killed Elena DeLuca, that he's been planning a war between our families for months, that he's been using your trust to position himself for a power grab." Victor's expression didn't change, but his hand moved to the file. He opened it slowly, read in silence. The room was so quiet, Roman could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Finally, Victor looked up. "You're accusing my oldest friend of treason." "I'm showing you facts," Roman replied. "What you do with them is your choice." Victor called an emergency council meeting that same night. 12 men in a private room, no phones, no recordings. Marcus Hale sat at the table, confident, unaware of what was coming. Victor didn't open with accusations. He opened with numbers. Bank transfers projected on a screen. Shell companies. Payment dates that matched the explosion timeline perfectly. Hale's face went pale. "This is fabricated," he said immediately. Roman's been compromised. He's been meeting with Elena DeLuca for weeks. He's feeding you lies to protect her. Victor turned to Roman. Is that true? Have you been meeting with her? Yes, Roman said. No hesitation, no excuse. The room erupted, voices overlapping, accusations flying. But Victor raised his hand. Silence fell. Why? Victor asked. Roman met his gaze. Because she was asking the same questions I was, and because she deserved to know the truth about who wanted her dead. Victor studied him for a long moment. Then he turned back to Hale. The numbers don't lie, Marcus, and you've been in my organization long enough to know I don't make decisions based on loyalty. I make them based on facts. Hale tried to speak, to defend, to deflect, but the evidence was overwhelming. By the end of the meeting, Hale was removed from the room. Quietly. Permanently. The Carrington way. Meanwhile, Elena had been conducting her own investigation. When she presented her findings to her father, the same bank transfers, the same shell companies, Salvatore DeLuca understood immediately. Carrington hadn't tried to kill his daughter. Someone inside Carrington's organization had, and that changed everything. For the first time in 30 years, Victor Carrington and Salvatore DeLuca met face to face. Not in a warehouse, not with guns, but in a neutral office with lawyers present. The conversation was tense, cautious, but honest. The war had been manipulated, engineered by people who profited from their hatred, and their children had uncovered it. Peace didn't happen overnight. Borders were still contested. Old grudges still simmered, but the hostility cooled. Meetings replaced violence. Negotiations replaced retaliation, and Roman no longer carried hatred the same way. He learned something that fire teaches everyone eventually. Destruction spreads easily, but rebuilding requires courage. Elena learned that influence doesn't come from the family you're born into. It comes from the choices you make, and sometimes the bravest choice isn't loyalty to blood, it's integrity in the face of fear. Here's what this story is really about. It's not about romance. It's not about heroes and villains. It's about the cycles we inherit and whether we have the courage to break them. Roman Vale spent 15 years believing his enemy was across the river, that the people who killed his brother wore a different name, that loyalty meant never questioning the family that took him in, but loyalty without morality is just obedience. And obedience without thought builds prisons no one sees until it's too late. Elena DeLuca spent her entire life trying to build something clean from something corrupt, believing she could take blood money and turn it into housing and clinics and hope. But she learned that you can't separate yourself from the soil you grow in. You have to change the soil itself. Fire teaches a lesson most people never learn. Destruction spreads effortlessly. A single spark can consume an entire building in minutes, but rebuilding? That takes intention, courage, the willingness to look at the ashes and decide what comes next. Roman and Elena didn't fall in love and ride off into some fantasy ending. They made a choice. To stop perpetuating hatred they didn't create. To expose the people who engineered conflict for profit. To risk everything for a truth that could have destroyed them both. Because sometimes the most radical act isn't violence, it's refusing to participate in violence anymore. And that's the question this story leaves you with. How many of the battles you're fighting were handed to you by people who never questioned whether they should be fought at all? Now I want to ask you something. If you were Roman, standing outside that burning building and you knew, absolutely knew, that the person inside was your enemy's daughter, would you still have gone in? Would you have risked your life, your loyalty, your entire future to save someone you were raised to hate? And if you were Elena, could you trust the man who saved you? Could you sit across from someone whose family destroyed yours and believe they were telling the truth? Here's the harder question. How many wars in your own life are you fighting because someone else told you to? How many grudges are you carrying that aren't even yours? Do you believe enemies can build peace? Or is conflict inevitable when power and pride are involved? Tell me in the comments what you would have done. Would you have saved her? Would you have exposed the conspiracy knowing it could cost you everything? And if this story made you think differently about loyalty, about truth, about the cycles we inherit without questioning, then subscribe, because the stories we tell next will challenge everything you think you know about right and wrong, about family and honor, about the difference between loyalty and obedience. Don't just watch these stories. Let them change how you see the world. Subscribe now so you never miss what comes next.